What happens when the traffic cops you trust are actually scammers, and the one person who stands between them and their big payday is a determined woman named Karen? Buckle up as recycling turns into a battle for justice in this jaw-dropping story of how one woman took down a fraudulent operation and exposed a dangerous scam that had been hiding in plain sight. Hold on tight. This is one ride you won't want to miss. In a quiet neighborhood where the most exciting events were usually the weekly recycling pickups or the occasional neighborhood barbecue, it wasn't often that anything out of the ordinary happened. Karen had grown used to the predictable rhythm of suburban life, nothing too dramatic, just peaceful, routine days. However, one Tuesday afternoon, as she was finishing up her chores and preparing to head out, she spotted something that immediately stood out as unusual. Karen had just finished sorting her recycling, a task she did religiously, and was about to leave her home when she noticed a pair of men standing near the corner of her street. They were wearing what appeared to be traffic cop uniforms, complete with reflective vests and badges that caught the sunlight. Initially, Karen didn't think much of it. Perhaps they were working for the city or helping out with traffic flow near the local school. It wasn't uncommon to see traffic enforcement around busy intersections during rush hour. However, as she continued watching, something didn't quite add up. The men seemed off. They were directing traffic, but there was a sense of disorganization in the way they handled the flow of cars. Their hand gestures weren't authoritative, but instead, they were more frantic, almost as if they were trying to rush people through a stop sign rather than enforce the law. One of the men waved cars through, while the other seemed to be pulling them over for no apparent reason. No official traffic cones, no vehicles marked with the standard city logos or police identifiers, and certainly no clear signals that this was a legitimate operation. Karen, ever observant, leaned closer to the window for a better view. It struck her that these officers weren't acting with the precision and professionalism she had come to expect from legitimate law enforcement. Their movements were erratic, and their actions appeared more driven by urgency than by the standard practices she'd witnessed countless times. But the red flag came when she noticed something even stranger. The men didn't have the usual insignia or patches on their uniforms. The badges were clearly not standard police issue, and the material of their uniforms seemed cheaper than what real traffic officers would wear. Something about the whole setup felt wrong. As the minutes ticked by, Karen's unease deepened. She watched as the two men stopped yet another car, this time a mid-sized sedan driven by an older woman. From Karen's vantage point, she couldn't hear their conversation, but the exchange was loud enough for her to see the tension mounting. The driver was arguing with the officers, gesturing with her hands and shaking her head. Karen could tell that the woman didn't understand why she was being pulled over. What stood out most was how the two men handled the situation. Instead of calmly explaining the issue, they raised their voices and seemed eager to escalate the conflict. They didn't offer any explanation for the stop. They simply handed the driver a fine, demanding immediate payment. Karen's suspicion grew, and her instincts kicked in. This wasn't an ordinary traffic stop. This was something else entirely. It was clear to her now that the two men were running some sort of scam. They were preying on unsuspecting drivers who might not question the legitimacy of their actions, convincing them that they had committed some minor infraction and needed to pay a fine. Right then and there in cash, with no paperwork or receipts. Karen, already aware of how scams could operate in deceptive and subtle ways, immediately recognized this as a fraudulent operation, one that was taking advantage of vulnerable people who weren't familiar with the law, or who might feel intimidated by men in uniforms. What made the situation even more suspicious was the way the men acted when the woman expressed concern about the fine. They didn't offer her the opportunity to contest it or explain herself. Instead, they pushed for immediate payment, using high-pressure tactics to force her into complying. Karen watched in disbelief as the woman handed over a large sum of cash, clearly flustered and unable to argue further. After the money exchanged hands, the two men waved her off with little more than a curt nod, and she drove away, visibly shaken. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a well-orchestrated scam designed to exploit drivers who didn't know any better. Karen had seen enough. She couldn't allow this to continue unnoticed. She felt a surge of determination to stop what she had just witnessed. The scam was taking place right under her nose, and she wasn't the type to sit idly by. She knew she had to act, but she wasn't sure exactly how to begin. At first, she considered calling the police, but Karen understood that doing so would require concrete evidence. After all, it was just one pair of men in uniforms, and without proof, they could easily deny any wrongdoing. She needed to be certain of what was going on before making any formal accusations. With her mind racing, Karen watched the two men continue their scheme, stopping one car after another, intimidating drivers into paying fines. Every time they were handed cash, the scam seemed to unfold further, making Karen's resolve even stronger. As Karen stood there, watching the scene unfold, she realized that this wasn't just a small-time fraud. The longer she observed, the clearer it became that these men had likely been operating like this for some time. They had a strategy, a script, and a way of getting away with their crimes unnoticed. Karen couldn't allow this to happen in her neighborhood. If nobody took action, they might continue to exploit more people, all while hiding behind the illusion of authority. Karen decided it was time to investigate further. She couldn't let these men get away with scamming more people. With a newfound sense of urgency, she set out to gather more information. There was no way she was going to let this continue under her watch. Little did she know that her quiet afternoon was about to turn into a full-blown mission to expose one of the most dangerous scams operating right under the community's nose. As Karen continued to observe the men posing as traffic cops, their actions began to reveal the true nature of the scam they were running. What appeared to be a random or disorganized traffic stop was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated scheme. The two scammers had clearly planned out every aspect of their operation to maximize the amount of money they could collect from unsuspecting drivers. Their method was simple but effective. They preyed on drivers' confusion, lack of knowledge, and reluctance to question authority. At the core of their scam was the tactic of pulling over vehicles for trivial or fabricated offenses. The drivers, caught off guard by the sudden stop, would be told they had violated some obscure traffic rule, rules that most people wouldn't even know existed. For instance, they might claim that a car was too close to the curb or that the driver had failed to use a turn signal in a situation where such a violation was borderline, if not outright imaginary. The key to their success was the ability to make the offense seem serious enough to require immediate action, but vague enough that the driver couldn't easily challenge it. The scammers knew that the majority of people would not question a law enforcement figure in uniform. It was the same reason people often paid speeding tickets without contesting them or complied with police requests without hesitation. They trusted the authority of the uniform. The scammers exploited this trust by acting the part, using uniforms that closely resembled those worn by legitimate traffic officers and adopting a tone of authority that left little room for argument. Once a driver was pulled over, the scam would unfold with rapid efficiency. The scammers would immediately present a fine, demanding immediate payment to avoid further action. This was where the scam took on a more insidious nature. Rather than issuing official tickets or summonses that could later be contested in court, the men would demand payment right then and there, often in cash. They would claim that the fine was too urgent to delay, pressuring the drivers to comply quickly before they had a chance to think through their options. For drivers who seemed particularly flustered or nervous, the scammers had a ready answer. If you don't pay now, it could turn into a bigger problem. What made the scam even more dangerous was the fact that the men didn't provide any documentation to back up their claims. No tickets, no receipts, no proof that any violation had occurred. They would simply take the money and let the driver go, knowing full well that there would be no way for the victim to track or dispute the payment later. Most people wouldn't even realize they had been scammed until it was too late. By the time they figured out that the fine was a fraud, the scammers would be long gone, leaving behind only confusion and frustration. Karen realized that the real danger of this scam was the ease with which the men could exploit unsuspecting drivers. They were well aware of how to manipulate the situation in their favor. The men targeted drivers who appeared distracted, stressed, or uncertain. These were the individuals who were most likely to cave in and pay the fine without asking too many questions. For example, a tired commuter might simply want to get back on the road without a fuss, and so they would hand over the money rather than argue with what appeared to be a legitimate authority figure. Similarly, older drivers who might not be as familiar with the nuances of modern traffic law would be easier targets for this type of scam. The scammer's strategy was not only about taking advantage of the drivers themselves, but also about maximizing the number of vehicles they could target. They worked in pairs, each handling a separate stretch of road to ensure that no one car was left behind. As one man waved down a vehicle, the other would quickly approach, catch the driver off guard, and begin his pitch for an immediate fine. By dividing their attention and covering more ground, the men could ensure they were pulling in as much cash as possible without wasting time. What made the scam even more difficult to detect was that it was happening under the guise of official traffic enforcement. The men wore authentic-looking uniforms, carried fake badges, and had all the mannerisms of real cops. They used the language of law enforcement, speaking with authority, and issuing commands that were difficult to question in the moment. It was this attention to detail that allowed the scam to continue unnoticed for so long. Most of the drivers who were stopped wouldn't think twice about the legitimacy of the men. After all, who would expect traffic cops to be frauds? As Karen continued to monitor their activities, she realized that the scammers were operating with complete impunity. Their fake authority allowed them to go unnoticed by passers-by and other drivers who might not have suspected anything was wrong. It was a well-oiled operation, one that relied on fear, confusion, and the unwitting cooperation of drivers. Karen knew that this kind of scam could easily escalate, affecting dozens, if not hundreds, of people before it was discovered. By now, Karen had become determined to stop the scam. She had witnessed enough to understand that these men were not only breaking the law, but were also exploiting people in vulnerable situations. Each time she watched one of the victims hand over their money, her resolve grew stronger. This wasn't just a small-time fraud operation. This was a dangerous scheme that could have widespread consequences if it continued unchecked. The more Karen observed, the more she understood that the scammers were well prepared and had likely been operating for some time. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but rather a deliberate plan to take advantage of drivers who simply didn't know better. Karen couldn't stand idly by while this scam continued. She knew that it was up to her to find a way to expose the fraud and bring the scammers to justice. What began as a suspicion had now become a mission. She had to figure out who these men were, how they had been able to operate undetected for so long, and most importantly, how to put a stop to their scam before more people fell victim to it. Karen understood that in order to bring down the scammers, she needed more than just her suspicions. She needed irrefutable evidence. She couldn't simply rely on what she had seen with her own eyes. She had to build a solid case that would stand up to any scrutiny. The first step in her investigation was to closely analyze the uniforms the men were wearing. While at first glance, they appeared to be official, a more careful look revealed some serious discrepancies. The badges on their vests were poorly made, lacking the sharpness and detail of genuine law enforcement insignia. The fabric of the uniforms themselves seemed cheap, almost flimsy, as if it had been mass-produced without any regard for authenticity. There were no identification numbers or proper insignia that would typically mark a legitimate traffic officer. Even the reflective vests they wore, which were supposed to be a standard safety measure, didn't bear the official logos or markings one would expect from real city or state workers. This was the first clear indication that something was wrong. Next, Karen turned her attention to the traffic citations the men were handing out. She had noticed that every time a driver was pulled over, the scammers handed over a citation that looked suspiciously generic. There was no logo, no city seal, and no case number, nothing that would suggest an official document from a legitimate law enforcement agency. She also realized that the citations were being written by hand, not printed out by an automated system like those used by real police officers. In addition, there were no clear instructions on how to pay the fine or contest the ticket, something that would normally be included in any legal ticket issued by proper authorities. The more Karen thought about it, The more it became apparent that these citations were nothing more than elaborate forgeries. Determined to track down the men's identities, Karen began researching local traffic enforcement agencies. She took note of the uniforms, insignia, and procedures used by official city or county officers. Armed with this knowledge, she started to cross-check the names the scammers had been using against the public records of local law enforcement. The men had introduced themselves with names that, on the surface, seemed plausible. But after some digging, Karen found no trace of these officers in the records of any legitimate department. There were no job listings, no incident reports, and no records of their presence in any official capacity. Her next step was to leverage her network of connections. Karen had friends in law enforcement, and although she didn't want to alert anyone too early, she knew that reaching out to them for a second opinion would be crucial. She reached out to a few trusted contacts who worked in traffic enforcement and asked if they recognized the names or uniforms the scammers had been using. What she learned confirmed her worst fears. The names were completely fabricated, and the uniforms were made with the intent of impersonating real officers. Furthermore, her contacts informed her that no legitimate traffic officers would ever demand payment on the spot without issuing an official ticket or citation that could be contested in court. Karen wasn't surprised that the scammers had taken great care in fabricating their identities. After all, the success of their operation depended on convincing their victims that they were real law enforcement officers. But the realization that they had been doing this for weeks, perhaps even months, only made Karen more determined to take them down. She had a growing sense of urgency. The longer the men were allowed to operate without being stopped, the more people they could deceive. Thousands of dollars had likely already been collected, and Karen knew that each day they went unchecked meant more people falling victim to their fraud. Next, Karen began gathering physical evidence. She knew that it wasn't enough to rely on circumstantial details. She had to get something concrete. She started to take note of the dates and times when the men were operating, as well as the specific intersections where they were most active. Karen also started taking photos and videos of the scammers in action from her window, discreetly documenting every interaction they had with drivers. She made sure to capture their vehicles, the citations they were handing out, and any other identifying details that might serve as proof of their scam. Over the course of several days, Karen's investigation started to bear fruit. She had gathered enough evidence to show that the men were operating a fraudulent scheme designed to extract money from unsuspecting drivers. With each new piece of information, Karen's confidence grew. She now had a clear picture of the scam, its methodology, and the identities of the perpetrators. However, she also realized that there was a bigger problem at play. The scammers were good at what they did, and they had created a system that made it easy for them to avoid detection. The challenge now was how to expose them and stop their operation without alerting them to her investigation. Karen knew she had to be careful. If the scammers realized that someone was onto them, they might change tactics or flee the area, making it more difficult to catch them. She couldn't risk giving them any opportunity to escape. So, she took her time to gather all the evidence she could before making her next move. She even went so far as to talk to some of the drivers who had been pulled over, carefully asking them questions about their experience without revealing too much. Many of them had paid the fine without questioning it, but a few had felt uneasy and later realized they had been scammed. These conversations gave Karen valuable insights into the perpetrator's methods and further validated her suspicions. Armed with enough evidence to make her case, Karen finally decided it was time to take the next step. She contacted her friends in law enforcement again, this time with a detailed report of the scam and the evidence she had collected. She knew that bringing the full weight of the authorities into the situation would be necessary to stop the men and ensure they faced justice. But even as she prepared to take the scammers down, she knew that the real victory would be when the entire neighborhood was made aware of the scam and other drivers were no longer vulnerable to the same tricks. Karen had started this investigation with nothing more than a suspicion. Now, she had the evidence to expose a dangerous scam, and she was ready to take action. With her evidence in hand, Karen knew that she had reached the crucial point in her investigation. While she had accumulated all the necessary documentation and proof to expose the scammers, she understood that it wouldn't be enough to simply report them. To ensure their operation was shut down once and for all, she had to catch them red-handed in the act. She knew the value of concrete evidence, something irrefutable that would leave the scammers with no room to escape. If she was going to bring them down, she needed to capture them while they were actively scamming drivers. After carefully reviewing her strategy, Karen decided that she couldn't risk confronting them directly just yet. A direct approach might alert the scammers to her suspicions, causing them to change their behavior or flee the area before law enforcement could intervene. Instead, she opted for a more covert tactic. Karen knew she had to blend in, become just another driver who could be easily pulled over, someone the scammers would target without a second thought. Karen knew the exact intersection where the scammers had been operating, and she decided to position herself there, strategically waiting for the men to begin their usual routine. She needed to become an unsuspecting target, just like all the other drivers who had been duped by the scammers' well-rehearsed scheme. To do this, she put on a simple disguise, nothing too elaborate, but enough to make her blend in and avoid standing out. She removed any identifying items from her car, making sure that nothing would suggest she was a part of the investigation. She kept a calm demeanor, knowing that her role was to play the part of an ordinary, confused driver who would fall for their tricks. As she waited, Karen's heart raced with anticipation. This was the moment of truth. She had seen how the scammers operated, but now she needed to experience it firsthand to ensure that her plan would work. She observed the intersection closely, noting the way the men positioned themselves and the subtle cues they used to pull over drivers. It didn't take long before the scammers began their usual routine. They signaled to cars, directing traffic in an erratic manner that made it clear they were operating outside the bounds of normal law enforcement procedures. Soon enough, the men approached Karen's car. Her anxiety surged, but she kept her focus. As they pulled her over, they immediately began their usual act, claiming that she had violated some obscure traffic rule. They tried to intimidate her into handing over an immediate fine using the same high-pressure tactics they had employed on other drivers. Karen feigned confusion, asking questions and pretending to be unsure of the violation they had mentioned. She asked them to explain in more detail, hoping that by appearing vulnerable and uninformed, she could get them to lower their guard. As expected, the scammers pushed hard for an immediate payment, using the same lines they had used on other victims. "If you don't pay now, it will escalate," one of them said, trying to instill fear in Karen. The other added, "This is a serious violation. We need payment right away, or we'll have to take further action." Karen, pretending to be overwhelmed and unsure, stalled for time, hoping to create the perfect opening for her plan to unfold. Then, the moment she had been waiting for arrived. The scammers demanded cash, threatening her with more severe consequences if she didn't comply. But Karen was prepared. Instead of caving to their pressure, she remained calm and collected. As the scammers pressed her for payment, Karen subtly reached for the hidden camera mounted in her dashboard, which had been recording everything since the moment they pulled her over. She knew this would be the key piece of evidence that would expose them once and for all. With the camera now in clear view, Karen made a move. In one swift motion, she revealed the recording device and addressed the men with a bold statement. "You're not real cops, are you?" The words hit them like a ton of bricks. For a split second, they froze, their expressions shifting from cocky confidence to shock and fear. They had been caught in the act, and they knew it. The facade of authority they had carefully constructed crumbled before them. Their scam had been exposed, and they were powerless to deny it. Karen could see the realization dawn on their faces as they understood the gravity of the situation. They had underestimated her, believing that she, like so many others, would fall for their lies and pay the fine without question. But now, with the camera documenting their every move, they had no way out. Their scheme was over. In that instant, Karen felt a rush of triumph. Her careful planning, her patience, and her persistence had paid off. The scammer's act had been revealed, and the evidence was irrefutable. She knew that she had the power to bring them down. With the camera still recording, she calmly stated, "I've been watching you for days. You've been scamming people, and I've got all the proof I need." The scammers, realizing they had no way to talk their way out of this situation, began to panic. They tried to backpedal, offering excuses and attempting to justify their actions. But Karen wasn't having any of it. She knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would expose them for who they really were. She immediately made her next move, pulling out her phone and dialing the police. With the camera still capturing the entire exchange, Karen calmly explained to the dispatcher what had been happening. She provided all the details of the scam, including the location, the men's descriptions, and the fact that she had caught them in the act. She made sure to emphasize that she had video evidence, making it clear that this wasn't just her word against theirs. The scammers were finished. As she hung up, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The men who had been terrorizing her neighborhood with their fraudulent scheme were now on the brink of being caught. With the evidence she had gathered, there was no way they could escape justice. The showdown had been intense, but it was over. The scammers had underestimated her, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. The community would be safe once again, and Karen had played a pivotal role in stopping the scam that had taken advantage of so many unsuspecting drivers. Once Karen had gathered the irrefutable footage and supporting evidence, she knew the next step was to bring everything to the attention of the authorities. This wasn't just about stopping two scammers, it was about making sure no one else fell victim to their predatory tactics. Armed with the video footage of the fraudsters in action, along with detailed notes and a thorough record of her observations, Karen went straight to the local police. She understood the importance of presenting her case clearly and methodically, ensuring the authorities had everything they needed to understand the scale of the operation and to act swiftly. Upon viewing the footage, the police were shocked. They hadn't expected something this elaborate, nor had they anticipated the depth of the scam. The fact that the scammers had managed to impersonate official traffic officers so convincingly made their operation even more dangerous. The video showed the men not only pretending to be cops, but also coercing innocent drivers into paying fines on the spot using intimidation and the false authority of their uniforms. The officers were able to clearly identify the fraudulent tactics, which strengthened Karen's case. With the full weight of Karen's investigation now in their hands, the police sprang into action. They worked quickly to apprehend the scammers. The authorities conducted a raid on the scammers' hideout where they found additional evidence: fake traffic tickets, counterfeit uniforms, and falsified records that showed how long the operation had been running. The two men were arrested without incident, and the materials used in the scam were confiscated as evidence. The police were able to confirm that the men had been running this fraudulent scheme for several months, possibly longer, targeting hundreds of unsuspecting drivers. Karen's decision to document everything and report the scam was now paying off. Not only had she stopped the two men from defrauding anyone else in the future, but she had also ensured that they would face the legal consequences of their actions. The video footage she had captured played a pivotal role in securing their arrest. Without it, the scammers might have been able to continue their operation, potentially harming more people before being caught. But Karen didn't stop with just reporting the crime. Realizing the importance of informing her community, she took steps to ensure that everyone knew about the scam and how to avoid falling for similar schemes in the future. She wasn't content with just seeing the perpetrators punished. She wanted to empower others by spreading the knowledge she had gained throughout the investigation. Karen took to social media to share her experience, making sure to highlight the key details that could help others recognize and avoid similar scams. She posted the video footage online, along with a detailed account of how the scam operated, the red flags to look for, and the steps drivers could take to protect themselves. Her story went viral almost immediately. People from all over the neighborhood, and even from neighboring towns, reached out to her. Many of them shared their own experiences with similar scams that they had encountered, unaware that they had been targeted by fraudsters until they saw Karen's post. The response was overwhelming. People were grateful for Karen's vigilance, and many drivers who had been victims of the scam were able to reclaim the money they had lost. The local police department received numerous calls from individuals who had been tricked into paying fines, and many were able to get refunds for the money they had handed over to the scammers. In some cases, the police were even able to recover stolen money from the perpetrators' accounts, further providing a sense of justice for those affected. As her story spread, Karen's role in uncovering the scam became widely recognized. She was hailed as a local hero for her bravery and persistence in exposing the fraud. But Karen was not content with just receiving recognition for her actions. She saw the attention her story was receiving as an opportunity to educate people about fraud prevention. She worked closely with local community organizations and law enforcement to host informational sessions about scams, how to identify them, and how to take action if you find yourself in a similar situation. Her efforts led to broader awareness of the dangers of impersonation scams, particularly in her area, where many residents had been unaware that such a fraud could happen in their own neighborhood. Karen took it upon herself to make sure that drivers knew their rights, understood the proper procedures when being pulled over by law enforcement, and were aware of the legal channels for paying traffic fines. She began volunteering at local schools, talking to students and parents about how to spot scams and stay safe from fraudsters who might be posing as legitimate authorities. But Karen didn't just stop at her community, she went even further. Her story became a topic of conversation at local media outlets, and she was invited to speak at several local news stations, where she shared her experience and offered advice to viewers about how to avoid falling for scams. Her message was clear. Scams were not always easy to spot, but they could be defeated with vigilance, knowledge, and a willingness to take action. Her advocacy went beyond just the issue of impersonation scams. Karen became a strong voice for consumer rights, using her platform to speak out about the broader issue of fraud. She worked with local authorities to help set up educational campaigns about the dangers of scams in general, encouraging residents to report suspicious activities and be proactive in protecting themselves from fraud. Karen's involvement in these campaigns allowed her to connect with others who were similarly dedicated to making their communities safer. Thanks to Karen's actions, a number of positive changes were made in her community. Not only were the scammers caught and held accountable, but the experience prompted a larger conversation about fraud prevention, law enforcement transparency, and consumer rights. Karen's story inspired others to be more aware of scams and more willing to stand up when they saw something suspicious. The once widespread sense of helplessness in the face of fraud began to shift as more and more people felt empowered to take action and protect themselves. Ultimately, Karen's efforts didn't just stop the immediate threat posed by the scam. They sparked a broader movement that led to greater awareness, stronger protective measures, and a community that was more united in the fight against fraud. Through her courage and determination, Karen not only protected her neighborhood, but also made a lasting impact on the lives of others, showing that one person could make a difference in the fight against scams. Stay one step ahead of scams. Subscribe to expect stories for more tips and real-life stories.